Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Bipartisan Policy Center's new report argues that piecemeal reforms can't solve today's labor and skills challenges. Instead, it calls for a shared strategy that shapes decisions across education systems, workforce programs, and employers. We'll explore what the data show and why the federal government hasn't already done this with Margaret Spellings, former Secretary of Education and current President and CEO of the Bipartisan Policy Center. Ms. Spellings, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Terry.
The Bipartisan Policy Center has recently released what it calls a blueprint for a national talent strategy, and the title of it is From a Nation at Risk to a Nation at Work. Tell me how this project came to be.
Well, as you might know, our country does not have a talent strategy. We have a national security strategy and national economic policy, but we really have not thought well enough and long enough and hard enough about how to leverage fully America's number one asset, our people. And given the urgency around AI and the disruptions, changes in our demographics, around immigration policy, and on and on and on, and frankly, given the sorry state of affairs around educational outcomes, really at all levels, but especially at K-12, which we haven't gotten anywhere near recovering from COVID, it's time to really focus on, given those things, how are we going to fully leverage this incredible asset, the American people, and how do we have a federal strategy around that urgent imperative?
When you think about the environment that you just described today, labor shortages, skill gaps, what feels genuinely new about the time we're in compared to previous eras or time frames?
Well, it's an age of disruption, absolutely, and it's an age of urgency. I think people across all sectors are wondering, if not afraid, of the disruptions that AI may bring. We're clearly in a time of recalibrating and discussing the federal role versus the state role in these programs. We know that there's been a lot of scrutiny, and frankly, there's a lot of question about how much value there is in federal investments. And so we know we spend about $250 billion a year across more than 50 programs, all of them well-meaning, but we're not organized for success. And so we attempted to step back from the kind of the micro aspects and think we need a plan. We need a strategy. We need information. We need connectedness. We need urgency. All of the things that will, I hope, cause people to focus as they must, given all of that, on how we're going to leverage the full talent of the American people.
We'll get into some of the particular recommendations in a minute, but I want to understand who you brought together to tackle this question.
Well, we are the Bipartisan Policy Center, and our orthodoxy is in our name. We believe that people coming together makes for better public policy, and public policy that can stick and can be refined and can work over time. So with that remit, we recruited two very able governors, Deval Patrick, former Democrat governor of Massachusetts, and Bill Haslam, former Republican governor of Tennessee, both of whom had fantastic track records in education across that full pipeline from higher ed, K-12, workforce, and so forth. And so we recruited them, and then along with about 24 other commissioners, one of my successors in the Obama administration, Secretary John King, state leaders from around the country, education chiefs, higher ed leaders, and the like. And they went to work for about a year with the support of 50 or 60 experts across 4 subgroups. So we had a K-12 group, a workforce group, a higher ed group, and importantly, and something that in my time around Washington we haven't thought in this way, we aggregated and built in the things that are going to cause people to be successful in and stay in the workforce. So paid family leave, childcare, retirement security. I mean, we know we have a lot of talent on the sidelines because of those issues. So how do we think about unleashing that talent on the sidelines with better focus on some of the things I've just mentioned.
Well, it sounds like a powerhouse team. And you yourself, of course, were a former Secretary of Education, a university system president. When you get down to it and talk about a national education strategy, what does that really need to pull together? And I know you had the panel led by governors because education oftentimes is a state first area of focus.
Absolutely, as it should be. I've worked around a lot of state legislatures and believe that fully. However, I believe, and the commission believe, that we need a federal role, that it is in part a civil rights role, it's an opportunity role. We know that, in the competitive economic environment that we're in globally, we can't stand on ceremony about bureaucracy. We need to make sure that everyone is focused and our resources are focused. If we're going to invest, we have to have outcomes that are worthy of those investments on behalf of the American people. So we asserted some principles that guided this work before we got into the development of this American Talent Strategy.
Well, at the national level, across the federal agencies, we have a whole bunch of agencies who have some piece of this workforce responsibility. Why haven't we ever created a national strategy for workforce before?
Terry, that's a darn good question. And so we aim to fix that. I think we've had the luxury of thinking, oh, well, here's a veterans population, or here's a Native American population, or here's K-12, or here's, but if that were working well enough, we wouldn't be where we are. So we have an urgent time, great need, and a real challenge about how we best use significant federal investments in service to this mission for everyone.
Who should own the problem then if you're going to have a national education strategy?
I mean, it starts with, our at the highest levels of the people with the biggest microphones in Washington to lay that out, to make the case that if we don't fully leverage our talent in this day and time, we are going to be in a world of hurt. We know what is before us with respect to AI disruption. We understand where kids are lacking recovery from COVID. They're not where they need to be on reading and numeracy. We have a very, honestly, in my secretarial days, I used to say it was if we were trying to keep people out of the system, not get them in and through. It's a very inefficient and very difficult system for the user. So how do we keep the student, the employee at the center of the policy work and the investments that we're making?
You mentioned the fragmentation of the system there. Where did the costs of navigating that complexity show up?
Well, every day, everywhere. If you're a university student and you're trying to navigate the federal financial aid system, if you're a parent of a K-12 child and you're trying to understand the role of school choice or the data or what the reading approach is in your state, I mean, it shows up in friction all across our system. And that's why we're calling for the creation of a National Talent Council that can, put these first principles before our country. What are the most important things that need to happen? How are we doing against them now? And how are we going to get to the promised land of better using resources, better using data, and greater urgency for our people?
The report suggests that Talent Council should be established in law, as I understand it, and then also placed in the executive office of the president. How would you imagine, let's just assume that both of those things happen, how would this council work?
Well, having worked at the White House, leading the Domestic Policy Council, I've seen successful efforts who do that all the time. So we have, the National Economic Council works like that. We have the Council of Economic Advisors that participate in that, the OMB, the Treasury Department. I mean, you've been in government. If it has the imprimatur of the White House and support from the Congress and is well resourced and has attention across the government, which is what this is going to take, then it can be effective. And there are many examples of doing that. I know from my time in the White House after 9/11, we had a 9/11 commission. And I mean, it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. This will not until we fully leveraged every single bit of talent of the American people. But I think it suggests that this is a big priority and we all need to pay attention.
And the report proposes some very specific things for that group to do right away.
Yes. Yes. Like understand where are we, where are our biggest gaps, to really, understand what are we investing in, why, and to what end. And so, we're used to using data in every other realm of our lives, whether you're choosing a restaurant or buying a car or getting your dog washed. we rely on data. In the government and in serving people and in leveraging federal funds, not so much. So how do we keep the main thing, set our priorities, and discern how we're doing against it? How do we develop the data systems in the federal government? Yes, but not only. How are they leveraged in states and in employers, so that we're using real-time best information, as this is incredibly organic and changes a lot over time.
I'm speaking with Margaret Spellings. She's the president and CEO of the Bipartisan Policy Center. Well, let's start down the path of the specific recommendations. But before we do that, I want to circle back to a number you put out right away. $250 billion in annual expenditures across all of the different federal programs.
About 150 programs.
Are we spending enough? Do we need to spend more? Do we just need to spend it differently?
How do we know? We have no idea. What are we trying to do across the 150 programs? They all have different objectives, different measurement systems, different accountabilities, different governance. So, we can better answer that question when we discern what, for whom, at what cost, for, and what outcomes, and harness that around this National Talent Council and the urgency in serving everyone. I think our ultimate objective, that I think all Americans would agree with, that every single person in this country ought to have the opportunity to have a successful life and family, and have the tools at hand to build their lives. Well, and that includes, obviously, education.
You talked about the Talent Council and its remit to create the data structures that would allow us to do that kind of measurement. That all kind of fits with the second tent pole, I think, in the set of recommendations, keeping learners and workers at the center of the education system and its pathways. So let's start with data. Where does the data come from?
Right now, it comes from all over the place. It comes from the Department of Education. It comes from the BLS. It comes from HHS. It comes from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and on and on and on. And likewise, it comes from states, and it comes from cities, and it comes from employers, and it comes from LinkedIn, and on and on. So how do we make sure that we're as smart as we can be, so that students can be empowered with and at the center of their own decision making and their own use of time and treasure in service to their development?
It seems that the report proposes a reimagination of the secondary education and post-secondary education pathways so that they're really targeted toward employment. How would that how would that change? How would it be different from what we're doing now?
Well, again, we have to decide, what are our expectations and how are we going to know that we've met them? But the kinds of things that I think are on the table are, do kids need to go to high school for 4 years? Should they be, should it be 3 years? Or should higher education be 3 years? How we use time, how we use learning that is mastery oriented as opposed to seat time oriented. So those are the things that I think are candidates for consideration after we agree on what are we trying to do and how well are we doing it now, and are we organized against those objectives.
The last few years have seen a rise in the conversation around skills-based hiring and stackable credentials. It seems to me the data question feeds into this, but how would you expand on that conversation around skills-based hiring?
Well, it has to be regional, and that's why states and localities are so important, because what we need in the Permian Basin of Texas is far different than what we might need in other parts of the country, in the fishing communities or lobstering communities in Maine, or in the manufacturing in Ohio, and so on. So I think it has to be student-centered and locally applicable. And we can do that with modern data systems that are available to us. We're not doing it now, and that's, and it has to be an important part of the Talent Council's work.
It seems that the higher education community is still having trouble adjusting to some of the shocks of the current economy. How would they take on this challenge?
Well, obviously, I'm still a believer that an important route for productive life is through our universities and colleges and job training programs. And so, there are things that we know are immutable in this and any other economy. People need to be able to read. They need to be able to work in teams. They need to have some level of literacy and numbers. And so what are those things that are table stakes throughout our education system? And then how do we help people learn to be adaptive in the days and weeks and decades to come?
We've talked a little bit about all the different organizations at the federal level that are involved in this process, and also about all the different levels of government that have a stake in this. When you think about a national talent strategy, presumably with some national goals around talent, how do you bring along the states, the counties, whose county school systems kind of drive the curriculum, even down to the community level? How do you get everybody aligned?
Well, I think it starts with leadership, period. And, I've seen that. I obviously was involved with the enactment of No Child Left Behind, which, by the way, bore, great fruit for, in the 16 years of the Bush and Obama administrations, we were going in the right direction because we were focused on closing the achievement gap and on basic skills in particular. And then we've drifted since. We started drifting and then COVID. But my point is that if we get our minds around the objective, we can harness the pieces together in ways that make sense and deliver results. That's the main thing, that they deliver results. So in that instance, we said, have your own standards, develop your own tests. Let's report those results in a disaggregated way, and let's have some consequences when there's failure. That's a good model, for managing anything.
There's a couple of quotes at the end of this report that I want to read. The first says, skeptics will say this commission's vision for the wholesale reform is not possible, that the political headwinds are too strong, and America's civic divide is too wide. And then it goes on to say, the risk remains, but the path to a nation at work is possible if we have the courage to act. So how do you respond to those kinds of critiques at this point?
Look, I think Americans know that we are in a time of incredible disruption, whether it's AI, whether it's politics, any and all. And they are yearning for leadership around the things that are most important to them. And I'm pretty sure that the things that are most important to them and their children are do we have a future? What is my path to success? How am I going to be able to have a family, buy a home, etc.? And so I believe that is, central to why we're doing this work. And, the results speak for themselves. We're not organized for success. We can do better. There's great urgency now, and people know it.
The reports received positive early responses, but that's just the first stage. What do you hope happens next?
Well, we are obviously pulling the pieces of this out and working on strategies for K-12, strategies around the paid family leave and child care aspects. I mean, here in Washington, and of course in states too, it's different actors, different jurisdictional authorities. So, how do we get an action plan that can go to task on every bit of this?
Have you had early positive feedback from the Trump administration?
We have from really, I think one of the things that I'm encouraged about is nobody disagrees with the urgency and the premise. We're not going to serve Americans with lives of opportunity without doing a much better job than we are now.
So when we check in with you a year from now, what do you hope you've checked off on the list?
Well, I think we will have gathered leaders together at all levels who will take ownership and greater urgency and more student centering and using data to better understand how we invest and to what end. So I think we'll have a lot more players on the field. And I think we will be starting down the road of developing the kind of information systems, the coalition of the willing across the business community, the governmental sector at all levels, and Americans themselves.
I've been speaking with Margaret Spellings. She's the president and CEO of the Bipartisan Policy Center. Ms. Spellings, I really appreciate you joining me today, and thank you for this important work.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, war headlines and market volatility might rattle TSP investors, but history offers some important perspective. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.